Running a business comes with a lot of what ifs, but luckily there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Another switchback. Wait, this isn't the top. Where's the summit? Why am I doing this?
At REI Co-op, we believe there are places within ourselves
Almost there. You got this.
that we find only outside.
Wow. This is worth it.
We have the gear, inspiration, and advice to help you get there. REI Co-op. Visit rei.com.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Greg Lukianoff, attorney, New York Times bestselling author, and president and CEO of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. This is actually Greg's second time on the show. Back in 2018, he and I discussed The Coddling of the American Mind, which he co-authored with Jonathan Haidt. Today, Greg's back to talk with me about his latest book, The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech, written with Nadine Strossen. Greg Lukianoff,
was it really that long ago?
Yeah, you know, it doesn't seem like that long, but it really...
Are you trying to make me feel old? Is this one of those, like, the year-old interventions that are about?
Oh, God, yeah. Well, let's stipulate that neither of us is that old, and it's good to have you back. How about that?
Thanks. Yeah, my dad just turned 99, so
wow.
I should thank my lucky stars. Yeah.
So I got to say, I loved how you organized the book. It was clear and concise and made a lot of sense to me. Basically, every chapter focuses on an argument for restricting speech. And in the first chapter, the argument is words are violence. And my understanding of this is that essentially the framers mistakenly thought that words and violence were separate things. But now we know that certain types of speech, at least, are, if not violence, are kind of essentially violence. And so therefore, they can, maybe even they should, be restricted. So I guess first off, I want to make sure I'm getting that argument correct. And if so, I want to know what your problem is with it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what we're addressing is on campus this sort of rhetorical escalation to basically be saying that your words are violence. And this is, I'm saying that specifically because that's actually something that students shout sometimes at speakers. This happened to Ann Coulter, for example, at Cornell, when she was shouted down one of the times she tried to speak there. And, they were telling her your words are violence. And this is also something that theme that's repeated all throughout my career. And it's funny because I feel like sometimes professors and students act like they're the first people to make this assertion. And I'm like, no, that's an ancient assertion. The idea that there is no meaningful distinction between expression of opinion, expression of preference, and actual physical violence. And that's a remnant of what sometimes sociologists call a culture of honor, essentially, where basically, like, if you insult my reputation, that is like a psychic wound towards me, which must be avenged. America was founded in the dawn of what's called a culture of dignity, which basically means that there is a major distinction between words and actual physical violence. They're considered to be quite different things. And I really want to emphasize, like, what an incredible advancement this distinction was for peace. And so there are really interesting figures in this, not just people like John Locke, but also like the religious, zealot, and reformer Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island. And he was very adamant, like, listen, physical violence, no, it's a crime. But we're in a battle for people's souls, so there are no holds barred when it comes to what you can do with with your mouth, what you can do with your tongue, essentially like the arguments you can make. And so a strong distinction between speech and violence is something that people would be like, oh, well, that's a human invention. It's like, well, everything is to a degree. Every word is, et cetera. But it's one of the greatest innovations we ever came up with for peaceful resolution of conflicts, for avoiding violence, but also for things like, prosperity, innovation, et cetera. So I always point out, like, this is not a new idea. It is a very ancient and very bad idea that we're getting back to because some people find it rhetorically useful to say, ooh, that opinion actually crosses the line into something more akin to violence.
And well, it seems like to me you go even further than this, because at the end of the chapter, you write something very interesting. The end game of speech's violence is that it makes actual violence inevitable. It's a formula for a chain reaction of endless violence, repression, and regression. So that takes it even further, saying that not just that words are not violence, but if you adopt this view, you're actually going to make things more actually violent. So I was hoping you kind of dig into that and sort of explain that.
No, 100%. Oh, and this is something that I saw students argue in the wake of the riot surrounding Milo Yiannopoulos back in 2017, a conservative provocateur for sure, who was showing up on campus. But then there were riots that involved, $500,000 in damage. There were people setting things on fire. There were people who were sent to the hospital. It was really bad. And a lot of people sent to the hospital, by the way, weren't even there to hear, from Milo Yiannopoulos. They wanted to see the craziness that was going on. And a lot of that kind of stuff hadn't happened in many decades. It's more like a remnant of like more of the kind of thing you would see more like in the 70s. But what was really troubling was after that, there were all of these op-eds in the Daily Californian, the lead student newspaper for Berkeley, defending what the protesters did in the riot by saying that Milo's words are violence, so our violence was self-defense. And it's like, okay, here's the thing. If your words are violence, you over there, your words are violence, and your violence is violence, and in both cases, I'm allowed to respond violently in response to that. That means that, and of course, like if the other person believes this too, this means that you can respond to any argument that they make with violence. So rather than having the strong distinction being like, listen, I thought what you said was really obnoxious and totally out of bounds, and I'm going to argue back with you, it's saying, I think what you said was totally obnoxious, really out of bounds. That's violence. I can hit you. And of course, someone can respond in self-defense if someone hits them. So it's a formula for an ancient, like an ancient blood feud type situation. And students don't seem to think some of these inevitable outcomes through because it's rhetorically useful to say, don't say that because your words are violence.
So essentially, it's like the idea where we're back in sort of ancient times. Somebody would say something insulting the other person's honor. They'd slap him with a glove, and the next thing you know, there's a duel.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think it's even worse than that. I mean, like, at least that tended to limit it between two people.
Sure.
It's more like a Hatfields and McCoys kind of thing, where it's like, you insulted my mother. Like we're going to fight for generations to come because it involves not just a one-on-one situation, it's group on group.
The second argument you bring up is words are dangerous. Now, to me, that sounds at least somewhat close to words are violence. And so I was hoping you could talk about what this means, how it connects to the first argument, assuming it does, and what you see as problematic with this view of words.
Well, it's not so much the words are dangerous part that we object to, because words, in a sense, can be dangerous. That's why we protect them. But words are dangerous, and therefore we should restrict them, is what we object to there. Because speech is the way we resolve our disputes in, at least ideally, in our society without regards to violence. But there's a great quote from Louis Brandeis saying that every idea is an incitement. And what he meant by that was, not that they should all be banned, but potentially, like, the reason why we protect speech is not because it's weak, not because it's powerless, but because it's powerful. It can create change. It can motivate people. It can also lie to people, for example. It can do all of these, potentially wonderful and potentially horrible things but in a sphere that's considered the legitimate way you resolve those disputes. So like the idea that kind of like words are dangerous and therefore we should ban it. It's like, no, words are dangerous and therefore we can use this to overthrow tyranny. We can use this to transform our society. We can use this, but also anything that could be used for good can also be used for ill. I could also use it to try to persuade people to do terrible things. But because we have a strong distinction between speech and violence, as soon as they start doing the terrible things, particularly, which are often illegal, that's a totally different thing. You can make a horrible argument for people to do horrible things, but with a strong speech action distinction, as soon as you start actually doing it, in some cases to jail with you.
I almost find myself wanting to use a different word. Instead of saying words are dangerous, I almost want to say words are powerful, because they can be used both for ill or for good, which would seem to be much more of a negative, or much more of a less negative connotation than saying they're dangerous.
Yeah. I think powerful is more what we're getting at here. Is that because words are powerful, that's why you protect them, not why you ban them. And I mean, if you look at every dictatorship in the world, every single one, they ban words because they are powerful.
But what about, a lot of people would say, what about hate speech? There's some types of speech that's so obviously just driven by racial or ethnic or some other sort of hatred. And especially if this speech is directed against people who have for generations or longer been, hundreds of years been subjugated. There's some relatively powerless minority. Surely there's some decent justification for at least somewhat restricting speech that has no other purpose than just spreading hatred.
Yeah, hate speech is definitely one of those ideas that feels like initially quite attractive. That essentially it's kind of like, oh, nobody should say hateful things. And you always have to remind people, that's a great normative position to have. But it's a very different thing when you decide to give government power over deciding what is and is not hate speech. And what is it going to look like? It's going to look like whoever's in power's sort of preference for what people do and do not say. This is something that you always have to remind people of. Laws are enforced by people, and with all the abuses that entails. So when it comes to hate speech, like I think the best the regulations that we have that best sort of like mirror what hate speech is trying to get at are, for example, racial harassment regulations on campus, for example. And racial harassment is not about simply saying something offensive. It's about a pattern of discriminatory behavior directed at someone, for their race or gender or sexuality that is severe, persistent, and pervasive, in this case, such that it denies someone the ability to carry on their education. It's a high standard, but it has to be. And it can't be simply that someone says something that is super offensive. And there's a First Amendment reason for it, but there's also a deeper philosophical reason. The First Amendment reason for it, which is also has some serious philosophy connected to it, comes out of the 1989 case Texas v. Johnson, which is about whether or not you can burn an American flag or whether or not you can punish someone for burning an American flag. And in that case, I think it's Justice Brennan, he says that if there's a bedrock principle in the United States under the First Amendment, it's that you can't ban something simply because it's offensive. And I always make the point, this is the right argument for a genuinely diverse, genuinely multicultural society. Because what people think are offensive, and I grew up in I'm first generation American. I grew up around a lot of other kids who are either immigrants or first generation. And it really is blazingly clear that depending on where you come from, depending on what religion you are, depending on what economic class you're from, how old you are, like even what region you're from, that people have very different ideas of what is and is not offensive. And I always made the point that if given the diversity of the people I played with as a kid, that if you banned everything that our mothers thought, was offensive, nobody'd be allowed to say anything at all. So that's the bedrock principle to defense. But I go a little bit even deeper. There's a value in knowing what people really think, full stop. If the idea that kind of you're safer for knowing less about what people really think is a delusion. It's kind of like my British mom's idea that, you solve a problem by not talking about it at the dinner table. It doesn't work. And what's funny here is that a lot of times when speech is banned for being offensive, people actually start to believe that people around them have more offensive or more bigoted beliefs than they actually do, as opposed to less. So it can lead to the situation where, and you see this in action in Europe. People always like point to, oh, well, Europe has hate speech laws and they're just fine. No, they're not fine. Britain is erasing 30 people a day at this point. That's like 11,000 people a year, which, by the way, is like almost 6 times as many people as were arrested per year in the first Red Scare. Like, it's completely nuts. Germany is sending people to jail for calling politicians a penis. Once you actually open the door to banning offensive speech, it tends to get out of control. And then people also point out, but people are saying offensive things. And in some cases, yeah, but they're also talking about things like immigration. They're also talking in highly secular countries about whether or not you want, if you become a majority, deeply religious, if that's going to be something that's going to be difficult. Like, that's something that people need to talk about, the difficult things. So the idea that you can have a hate speech law that won't eventually be enforced in a way that just kind of reflects the opinions of those in power, I think is naive.
I think a lot of people hear this and then think, but wait a second. You're not considering what can happen in the absence of these things. And they'll say, take a look at, for instance, the rise of the Nazis in Germany or the Rwandan genocide. And I bring these things up because toward the end of the book, you talk about those two cases, right? And what is it that you find when you look at those cases?
Yeah, now this is a favorite argument of Gene Stefanik and Richard Delgado, two of the leading lights, so to speak, in the speech codes movement in the 1980s. Delgado wrote an article called Words That Wound. I think the original one came out in like 1980, essentially. And I've debated him, actually, at Williams. And he, I think, has a lot of weight on the idea that what caused the Nazis was a Weimar Republic that was too protective of freedom of speech. And it was really funny. Well, first of all, I'm kind of like, so you're saying that excessive concern for liberty is how excessive protections for like human rights is how you got the Nazis. Okay, sure. That doesn't sound quite right to begin with. But then when you look into it more, you're like, whoa, okay, wait a second. Weimar Germany wasn't protective of freedom of speech. I mean, people will point to like Cabaret and be like, yeah, Berlin was permissive. They didn't have to be, by the way. A lot of the stuff that they tolerated was actually against the law, technically. But Nazis went to jail for saying offensive things about Jews. They went to jail for that. Hitler wasn't allowed to speak after being arrested for the beer hall putsch in 1922. He wasn't allowed to speak on campus. He wasn't allowed to actually give talks for several years. And what do the Nazis do with this? When, a Nazi got out of jail, they would throw a big rally. They made posters of Hitler with tape on his face saying, and it's funny because it reminds me of how small the world was at the time. Of 2 billion people in the world, only 1 is not allowed to speak on German campuses. And of course, that's Hitler. They turned it into a PR victory. And so here's the thing. Weimar Germany wasn't particularly tolerant of free speech. They had all sorts of free speech crimes. So this is why it's called the Weimar fallacy. What they were way too tolerant of was right-wing violence. So, I mean, I'm not big on capital punishment, but I'd say that in 1922, if they hung Hitler after trying to overthrow the government, we'd probably be living in a better world, to be fair, or put him to jail forever. They tolerated Nazi violence and other forms of extremist right-wing violence. They are less, and I say right-wing specifically because they were less tolerant of left-wing violence. They should be tolerant of no violence. That essentially that was actually the real problem with Weimar, is that they were too tolerant of violence, not too tolerant of speech, because they weren't particularly tolerant of speech. Oh, and when it comes to Rwanda, the interesting thing about Rwanda is that we're talking about speech in Rwanda when you're on the radio urging people to kill specific people or go to their houses or these people might be home. That's not legal even in the United States under the First Amendment. That's worse than incitement. That's conspiracy to genocide. So like the idea that it's like some excessive commitment to freedom of speech led to this in Rwanda. It's like, no, this isn't what happened. There was a conspiracy to kill people that was directed from the top, which isn't protected anywhere. But here's the thing. there's a kind of magical sense you get from some people that if we just had a more enlightened law in the place, that would fix problems somehow magically without people enforcing them. By the time you get to a situation where people from all the way to the top of one society, people on the radio are trying to organize to commit a genocide, the fact that there's a law in the book saying that you can't do that isn't sufficient. So
you don't really think that hate speech laws do all that much to disincentivize hate speech, and so they fail on their own in their own terms, essentially.
Oh, I believe they make them worse, like flat out, and I'll explain how. So, France, for example, passed laws sort of banning anti-Semitic speech back, I think, in the 90s, and a lot of Europe has passed these anti-hate speech laws. And by pretty much every measure we can find, certainly anti-Semitism has gone up in these countries. America didn't pass these, and you don't see a similar spike. And I think, and of course, there is the argument that essentially having immigration from a lot more countries that have beefs with Israel can actually is part of the reason why that's increased. But I also think there's something called a group polarization going on here. Censorship doesn't change anyone's opinion. What it does is it encourages people to talk. That it basically really hyper incentivizes the idea of, I should only talk to people who agree with me on this. If I'm going to say my anti-Semitic thing, I better only say it to other people I know are pretty anti-Semitic themselves. And here's the thing. You get more and more radicalized in the direction of the group. And I was on Bill Maher, and I put it this way. It's like, yeah, you've basically required that anti-Semites only talk to other anti-Semites, and then you're shocked that they become more anti-Semitic. Who could have seen that coming?
Grandpa's here.
Hank's always helping out. Grandpa style. Now he's treating his prostate cancer with help from Xtandi enzalutamide. Xtandi 40 milligram tablets treats men with prostate cancer that has spread to other parts of the body and responds to a medical or surgical treatment to lower testosterone. Xtandi may cause serious side effects: seizure, a brain condition called PRESS, allergic reactions, heart disease that can lead to death, falls and bone fractures, swallowing problems, or choking that can lead to death. Stop Xtandi and get medical help at once if your face, tongue, lip, or throat start swelling. Tell your doctor at once if you faint, have a seizure, quickly worsening headache, decreased alertness, confusion, vision problems, chest pain or discomfort, or shortness of breath. Xtandi can cause harm to an unborn baby or miscarriage. Use birth control during and 3 months after Xtandi. Common side effects include muscle and joint pain, feeling unusually tired, hot flashes, constipation, less appetite, diarrhea, high blood pressure, bleeding, falls, fractures, and headache. Talk to your doctor and visit Xtandi.com.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Got a car to sell but no time to waste? Hop on to Carvana.com to get a real offer for your car in seconds. All you have to do is enter your license plate, answer a few quick questions, and if you accept the offer, Carvana will pay you as soon as you hand the keys over. They even offer same-day pickup in many cities. Save your time, score some cash, and sell your car the convenient way to Carvana. Pickup times vary. Fees may apply.
After you hate speech, you move on to what are often called shout downs. And it's where people who are opposed to a speaker, basically shout them down, don't allow them to speak. Now, what those folks will say is, hey, we're just exercising our free speech rights too. You don't think it's a very good argument, do you?
No, I don't think it's a good argument at all. And I think shout downs are kind of like the most classic form of sort of mob censorship, where essentially a group of people decide for everyone else what they're allowed to hear. And this is the thing and students will make this argument kind of like with a straight face when they'll like march. And by the way, the last 2 years have been the 2 worst years for shout downs, 2023 and 2024 in history, as best we can tell. We went back as far as we could, and we couldn't find this number of shout downs anywhere. And particularly if you watch these things in action, in almost all cases, there are people there who want to hear the talk that the activists show up and shout down and prevent from going on. And it's a group of people deciding for everyone else who they're allowed to hear. And I feel like I feel like these same activists would immediately understand this if they had a speaker they wanted to hear, and then a bunch of people showed up and said, you can't listen to this person because I don't like them. It's like, no, that's mob censorship. That's actually something that's about as illiberal as it comes. And it particularly scares me that this is happening on campus, because it's like, no, you're supposed to be at the absolute top of people who want to hear opinions that they disagree with, even opinions they hate, first, so they actually understand where the other person's coming from. And that's something that gets left out of this. And second, that if they want to fight back against it, yeah, fine, protest outside. But even better, go in and ask some hard questions, write about it, refute it, all this kind of stuff. But if you show up and decide to use your brute force to make sure that no one else can hear that speaker, you are a mob censor.
I want to ask you about the shout downs in a current political context, I guess, and that's in the last few months, we've seen a lot of, especially Republican members of Congress who've had these town halls, and they've been really raucous. And in fact, what Republican leaders have suggested is, well, hey, listen, just don't hold any more town halls. And I don't know how I feel about that, but it seems to me that some of what we're seeing are maybe shout downs as well. What's your take on all this in the context of a free speech?
Yeah, it worries me because free speech is a good unto itself. I believe it's a human right that attaches to every human being. But it's not as useful if no one's listening. Free speech is at its absolute highest usefulness to society when people actually will hear what someone's trying to say, try to understand where they're coming from, take seriously the possibility they might be wrong, and see if they can actually, improve their ideas or in some cases even try to compromise. I feel like we're at a moment that is we're at a sort of crisis level of polarization, and things have gotten so nasty, is that pretty much both on the right and the left, I feel like the very first thing you hear when someone's evaluating, whether or not they think someone should have a free speech right is a kind of sometimes an oblique and sometimes really direct reference to their politics, that essentially they believe in free speech for me, but not for thee. And it's difficult. And I've talked about this in a larger political context. For most of my career, there was, as a free speech defender and a First Amendment lawyer, and I've been doing this now, by the way, for almost 24 years. For most of my career, there was a civil libertarian left, which is the tradition I come from, and a libertarian right, where, like genuine kind of like Reason Magazine type libertarians, like they're pretty serious on freedom of speech. I feel like at the current moment, with the sort of progressive left and the populist right, that there's a lot less of that. We don't really know who to appeal to. And so we're in a weird position where currently the defenders of freedom of speech in the United States is really more the center. And that's weird historically. It's because the center is not necessarily your most reliable friend, because they get that they should have their own free speech rights. But if it's really intense, I'm not so sure. So we're in a troubling period. And here's the thing I like to remind people. I call my Substack The Eternally Radical Idea because free speech is not normal historically. It is a weird, difficult idea because it's about basically saying that you should defend a painful process of figuring out what is true or understanding the world. It's much more normal historically for free speech to be on the losing end of that fight. But America's been pretty great historically at actually defending it, at least compared to other countries, with massive failings here and there, absolutely and doubtlessly. But still, like compared to a lot of the rest of the world, we've historically done pretty good. I feel like we're becoming in this way kind of like every other country in history at the moment, and it scares me. I hope the center will hold on this.
Another argument you bring up for restrictions on free speech is what you might call technological. The idea being that, back in the day, before the internet was everywhere in everyone's phone, maybe it made sense to sort of allow even controversial speakers to say whatever they wanted to say. But now, it's not. If you want to hear that, you can go online anywhere, pretty much anytime, and hear basically any view. And so we don't really need to protect free speech in public areas. If you want to hear this, maybe you don't get to hear Milo or Ann Coulter or someone like that speaking on the quad, but you can pull up a YouTube video, do what you want, and you get the same thing. So what do you think about that argument?
Yeah, the idea that sort of like speech, you can go find speech if you like it. If you want to find it, is not an argument for censoring it anywhere else. Like the idea that it's kind of like, oh, well, if you want to go hunting for these other opinions, you can find them out there. So we don't need to protect it. There's no limiting factor to this argument. It's basically saying kind of like, if you wrote a book, I don't have to let you speak on this campus because people are going to take out your book. And it's like, no, that's nonsense. And what's particularly funny about like some of these campus speakers is that there's a lot of political homogeneity on a lot of campuses, and sometimes some students have to sort of ship in the political homogeneity and the idea that kind of like, oh, we don't need speakers on this campus. Like, well, actually, if you don't actually have enough disagreement, it's actually an unhealthy environment for the production of knowledge, for the production of ideas. So you might need to ship people in. But since writing, and it's so funny because like, we just handed War on Words in, like we did it in kind of record time and it came out super fast. But my argument's already also shifted to include kind of like this sort of potential godsend or disaster of artificial intelligence. And I keep on making the point that AI alignment, like if your AI alignment idea is let's make sure the AI doesn't teach everyone how to make chemical weapons really easily, I'm with you.
Yeah.
If you're saying instead, though, like, and some of these laws are basically saying this, that if the knowledge produced by the LLM is used for bad purposes, then you should be allowed to sue the LLM for producing knowledge. And I'm like, okay, guys, AI does have some potentially terrifying downsides. And one thing that's got to be really clear is we can't be training this thing to lie to us. Like we have to actually, this is why I keep on saying truth is existential at this point. It can't be lying to us for our own good. And there's been interesting thoughts on like how you actually can potentially rein in the potential massive downside of AI out of control. And there's this great TED talk by this guy, Yoshua Bengio, who was an early sort of AI pioneer, basically arguing for something that he calls scientific AI, where it's low agency AI. It's just there for truth seeking. It's just there to keep track of what the world actually looks like. And you can optimize for that in a variety of ways, particularly if your goal is not don't hurt anyone's feelings. It's accurately describe the world. And I'm not saying that every AI has to be like that and low agency, but if you want something watching the AIs, you want the one that's actually not trained to tell you what you want to hear. It's going to tell you what's actually happening. So I think at this point, a lot of these sort of excuses for censorship are particularly dangerous, and particularly kind of because like at this point, like I said, truth is existential.
I wanted to ask you about an argument you mentioned from, well, not an argument so much, but John Stuart Mill's, what you call his trident. And you think it's pretty important. In fact, you say it's such a strong argument in favor of freedom of speech that you've actually never heard a persuasive refutation of that argument. So can you tell folks what this trident is and why you think it's so powerful?
Oh, yeah, it's a wonderfully simple argument at the same time. And I mean, people come back to John Stuart Mill, and sometimes like even my beloved friends like Jonathan Rauch will kind of like pick on First Amendment people and free speech people for coming back to Mill so often. But I'm like, well, unfortunately, the guy was a genius. Like literally, like he was like speaking Greek when he was 3.
Crazy, yeah.
Yeah, no, he's nuts, like how smart this guy was. But he also was such a beautiful and clear writer. I mean, like, there's so many things that you read in the 19th century that are just a pain to read, but not Mill. Like Mill's 1859, St. Mary's Origin of Species book on liberty, it's an elegant, beautifully written defense of free speech. And he basically just, throws out this idea saying, listen, in a truth-seeking argument, and I always make the point that, by the way, most of what we say is actually not truth-seeking. It's an expression of preference and that kind of stuff. But when you're actually trying to seek truth, there's really literally only 3 possibilities. 1, you're wrong. 2, you're partially wrong and partially right. Or 3, you're completely right. That's probably the least of those 3.
Right.
So, okay, first of all, and all 3 of them, you need freedom of speech. And here's why. 1, you're wrong. Like God forbid, like you're wrong and nobody can tell you that. That's a disastrous situation, particularly if you have power. And that's what you see in all the, ancient monarchies, just some idiot who actually was absolutely dead sure of their ideas and disaster results. The most likely one, the one that happens the most, is that you're partially right and partially wrong, but you're only really going to get to what is what through that process of discussion, to be like, oh, right. Yeah, I got that little, oh, no, you got a good point there. And then you adjust, and then you get closer to truth. And the third one, the one where you just happen to be entirely right, even then you need freedom of speech. Why would you need freedom of speech? because, and this is, he talks about a lively impression. It's just a really beautiful writing. But what he's getting at is that if you just happen to be right, one, it's very hard to know you're right in the first place. But second, you will just hold that belief as if it's a prejudice if nobody has ever actually challenged you. And if that continues like down the generations, like essentially like you end up in the situation where it's basically like a dead dogma that everyone's like, well, that's correct. But nobody understands why, because it's never actually been challenged. You've never actually done the mental work to figure out why you believe that. And believe me, I have seen this one in action on campuses all the time where, you know, I come from the liberal, you know, background. I always say liberal, not progressive, but from an old school kind of liberal background. And I believe in a lot of these kind of like left-coded causes. But when I watch some of the younger students defend a lot of these policies they agree with, they don't actually know the good arguments in favor of them because they're not used to actually being challenged on them. So like if you hold something merely like a dogma, it's almost like it's no better than superstition. You need free speech to even understand why you believe what you believe in the first place. And by the way, given the actual nature of truth, it is probably the case that you might think that you're absolutely right, but then you actually realize either you're wrong or you're in that middle category again where you're like, okay, I wasn't getting it. I didn't get the whole thing.
Yeah, you know, that middle category you talk about when you were explaining it reminded me of all people, Friedrich Nietzsche. And here's why, is that
interesting.
I'm fascinated by Nietzsche, but I keep on finding whenever I go back to him, I find myself thinking, if only he'd been part of some community where there'd been some pushback. And you see this, I think, with a lot of brilliant people who aren't involved with any sort of a real dialogue with other folks who disagree with their views. There may be some real gems there, but separating that out. And I find myself when I read Nietzsche and some other folks as well, who are kind of like that, just thinking, my God, how much better this could have been if he'd gotten some pushback and refined his ideas through that kind of process. And yet we don't have that. So it seems to me that's not just Nietzsche, but that's a lot of folks, really.
What an excellent point. I love that. I mean, he, you know, maybe I wonder how pleasant he would be to argue with.
Oh, God.
You know, definitely. Yeah.
Maybe not so much.
Yeah. But that's a very cool way to think about it. Yeah. Like Nietzschean dialogue.
Yeah, that would be.
I like it.
So, yeah, you know, I think some people would say, well, listen, these folks who call themselves free speech activists, right, or anti-woke, what they are largely, you aside and other folks maybe, a few exceptions, but really what they mostly are, they're conservatives. They want a license to sort of punch down, to demean the most vulnerable people, the easiest targets in our society. And you know, you get this thing where for a while it was like almost every week, some rich, privileged, white male comedian would be whining about how, oh, the kids today are canceling me. And honestly, it's hard for me to really feel a whole lot of sympathy for these guys. It's more like a, hey, check your privilege already, dude, sort of response.
Yeah.
I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, sure. I mean, like, well, for one thing, I do always object just to the idea, and I talk about this in my book, Canceling the American Mind, with my co-author, Ricky Schlott, is that we've made it too easy for ourselves, and both on the right and the left, to be able to just sort of not listen to someone if we are like, you're a conservative, I don't have to listen to you anymore. That's so much of the way we argue on social media. I think it's improved a little bit. Maybe not a blue sky, but like I don't know as much as that is. But just labeling someone, you know, right wing or fascist or libtard or like whatever, like it basically means I don't have to listen to you anymore is something that's actually a major problem. Now, that being said, do I think there are free speech hypocrites all over the political spectrum? You bet. And I see it a lot. And I do get mad, by the way, though, where someone will, you know, in frustration with, you know, so-called free speech defenders, and then they'll add in someone like Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA, and I'm like, Charlie Kirk, like a conservative activist who runs something called the Professor Watch List, which lists like professors with wrongthink, and in some cases like their addresses and how to contact them to get them fired. and he's had that for a long time. It's like, yes, no, he doesn't mean it. Like he means free speech for him. But I've seen this also, activists on the left who basically kind of like they are really concerned about threats from the right, do not give a damn about threats from the left. Like, and this is frustrating. But within the sort of free speech community of people who do this all day long, we don't always agree, to be clear, but they're principled people who actually care about this. Now, I do think that sometimes young people don't get that growing up, freedom of speech was kind of, and grew up in the 80s and was like a teenager in the 90s. Not a pretty good time to be all those things, by the way. They don't get that essentially that this was one of the defining characteristics of being a liberal, was being pretty unapologetically pro free speech. So like a lot of like the free speech champions who exist, including, of course, my co-author, Nadine Strawson, who is an icon in this stuff. And she's very much on the left, but she believes in free speech for everyone. And that was completely normal up until recently. But you could watch the political valence of freedom of speech changing over the last, 30 years, in part because there were people, and this is something that Richard Delgado, who I mentioned before, would say, is essentially like, well, liberals are right about a lot of stuff, but they're wrong about freedom of speech. That's really more of like that's something that should basically belong to the right wing. So there's pushing and pulling going on in this phenomena where people want to dismiss it now as being just like a right wing talking point, which is, of course, manifestly ridiculous. But I do think that, and this is something that's so predictable, is that right now people have such incentive, socially to dismiss free speech when the other side makes the argument. But when they see that their own free speech is under threat, suddenly they start speaking from the hymnal of freedom of speech. But what I found frustrating is sometimes they don't extrapolate that out to be kind of like, yeah, by the way, I should have defended this all the time for everybody, because guess what? It's always valuable to know what people really think. Full stop.
I feel like maybe I should try to make a distinction, because I think there's a distinction. You mentioned being a kid in the 80s and 90s, and that's kind of my era. And I was a teenager in the 80s, and I worked construction for a bit. And the stuff that I heard around me, both in school and definitely on job sites, my God, you'd curl your ears today. But I feel like there must be a distinction between that sort of stuff that was sort of acceptable back then that isn't now. But that seems to me to be more changes in the culture, as in changes in the law and policy. I wanted to, because there's an important distinction there, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And this is something that people really need to get, is that for people like me, like civil libertarians, we think that people really need to be more concerned about exertion of government power, particularly over things that are like basic rights. They will use it in their interest. They will use it to, ban, talking points that they don't like, without even necessarily fully understanding that they're doing it, or in some cases, very much fully understanding what they're doing it. The way you actually create these kind of changes is sometimes a little bit more frustratingly slow process of cultural engagement. Because there are a lot of stuff that people would say when I was a kid that they don't say anymore, because it's just too, it's just considered way too rude to say, and inappropriate and insensitive and all this kind of stuff. But that was a cultural shift. That wasn't encouraged by the fact that we have hate speech laws, because we don't have hate speech laws. During the same time that this cultural shift was going on, campus speech codes were being shot down by courts left and right. But I'll be damned if we don't speak more carefully and more sensitively, today than we did when I was a kid. I will say, I think we've probably reached a point where we're probably not talking frankly enough. But I would say that, the kind of obnoxiousness, the kind of, like dismissive, sometimes homophobic speech that was common when I was a kid, that went away not because of legal compulsion, but because of the sort of a correct mechanism of cultural change and cultural. And that's what to get back to the idea that speech is powerful, that was something that cultural change was partially came to be because of things like persuasion and actually increased empathy. And as Steve Pinker points out, people reading books about people who weren't like them. And that's the exact acceptable way to actually achieve these cultural changes. If you try to do it from by compulsion of law, boy, that's not going to end up where you think it's going to end up.
Well, we can't have a conversation about free speech without talking about the marketplace of ideas, right? Now, to me, that's sort of what I will call a naive belief that if you allow every view to be heard, well, the best ideas will win in the marketplace of ideas. Okay, maybe it can work in practice. I have my doubts, but if you buy into that general viewpoint, you can argue from there that, well, there's a place for the state to kind of come in and level the playing field so that ideas can fairly compete. I wanted to get your take on, well, both, I guess, in general, the marketplace of ideas in general, and also this idea that, well, if you want a marketplace, one person shouldn't get the big booth at the front where someone else just gets some little side thing stuck away in the back there.
Yeah. So the marketplace of ideas, originally came from a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes in the 1919, I think, where he said about sometimes the best way for truth to find its way is through the competition of the in the market of ideas. He didn't exactly put it that way, and the marketplace of ideas term was later more coined by, I think, William O. Douglas many decades later. But Holmes was a deep thinker, and one of the points he was making was essentially, sometimes the only way that you're really going to figure out what's true is, or really in this case, he's talking about like the democratic process, which argument wins, not necessarily even if it's true, is through that contestation. And he's surely right about that, particularly with the qualification that sometimes it is the case. I think it's funny. I think that, but then the marketplace of ideas gets reinterpreted by some people, and I think this is a straw man version of the marketplace of ideas, that the best idea will always win. And I don't really know anybody who thinks that. I think, however, the best idea doesn't stand a chance in hell if you can't say it in the first place. So it's one of these things where having freedom of speech is necessary but not sufficient for the best ideas to win. Yeah. So basically, like if you have a situation, like Soviet Russia, where my family fled, where someone's saying, actually, if you make, seeds cold, they don't suddenly become winter. They don't suddenly be able to grow in the snow. And that person, immediately is sent to the gulag, as happened in kind of like a Lysenkoism. You end up in a situation where truth doesn't stand a chance because you can't even challenge the dogmas. So that's necessary but not sufficient. My preferred and actually I do find it funny, though, that one of the places where the marketplace of ideas metaphor is least popular is in the one place where it actually should be as close to true as possible, which is academia, where essentially academia is supposed to be a place where you argue things out, you do experiments, you do testing, you do persuasion, you do all of these things with the hope that at least better ideas will rise after you've defeated really bad ones or ones that simply don't test out. So I do think actually the marketplace of ideas, correctly understood as not being some inevitable process, makes the most sense in academia. However, my point, is more from an epistemology standpoint. And I call this the pure informational theory of freedom of speech, which I've already alluded to. Sometimes when I'm being literary, I call it the lab and the looking glass. Basically, like anything that you see about humanity is worth knowing. Is that everything about what humans believe or think is absolutely vital data to have if you wish to understand the world. The idea that you can understand what's actually going on when everyone's lying about what they really think is foolish beyond belief. So I actually have a very expansive idea of freedom of speech having value from partially like a scientific standpoint, from an anthropological standpoint, that you need to know what people really think to understand the world. And by the way, that includes their misconceptions, because we're all filled with misconceptions, but a commonly held misconception can change the world. The weird thing is sometimes a commonly held misconception can change the world for the better, but commonly held misconceptions are mostly dangerous. But the idea that we're safer from those from not knowing what those are is nuts, as far as I'm concerned. So the marketplace of ideas, correctly understood as not being some inevitable process of truth always winning, has its place, and I think it's particularly academia. But I prefer the idea that everything about humanity is worth knowing. It's an old school kind of humanist kind of way of looking at things.
And so if you take that logic, then again, some folks would say, well, the next step then is saying, if we do want all these views to be heard, then we need to find some way to level things out so that somebody who has an enormous amount of resources and power, and this is kind of this old argument about against free speech that, well, it just simply reinforces the status quo because the more powerful can always speak louder and have more rhetorical tools and education and that. And so if we really do care about the truth, then we should actually take some real efforts to ensure that there's some equality in how these voices get out. In fact, I would argue this is one of the main sort of philosophical underpinnings of campaign finance regulation movement. Mm-hmm. And so what do you think about that argument?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think there are lots of ways to address it. But first and foremost, and this is something that I address a lot, is, and I know this is not what you're saying, but this is an argument I run into on campuses in particular, is freedom of speech is an argument made to sort of like justify power. Like essentially, like freedom of speech exists to serve the powerful. And I always make the point that makes no historical sense. And this is what I talk about is it seems like young people have been taught that free speech is the argument of what I call the 3 Bs: the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. And I explain that this is just bad history. So when it comes to the robber baron, like the wealthy and powerful, I always make the point that historically, the wealthy and powerful are protected by wealth and power. They don't need a special protection of freedom of speech for regular people. In fact, they generally don't want that because they want those people to shut up. They just want to be in charge. And when it comes to the bully and the bigot, when you move to democratic societies, here's the thing. If they have sufficient votes, they still get to call the shots. It's literally the case in a democratic society. The only people who need special protections for freedom of speech are minority points of view, people who are unpopular with two types of people, 2 groups of people. One, the majority in a democracy, and with the powerful. So freedom of speech is something that exists to protect. You only actually need this extra protection because the other people do just fine without it. So it is an innovation to protect unpopular points of view. So there's that on the power question. Can you have things that surface, more people's ideas? Yeah, you can. And I'm a fan of these various approaches. I actually think social media, has had some democratizing effect. It's also had a cacophonous effect in that there's been so much of it, it's kind of like overwhelming, and it has led to what I call sort of like an epistemically anarchical period, where things are just, kind of crazy. Now, what I fear, of course, and I come back to this again, is the idea of trying to make free speech equal, trying to make, to amplify voices and silence others. When that's in the hand of the government, that's China. That's Russia. Like they will pick the voices that they think are important to hear, the ones that they think are useful to hear. You shouldn't expect power to be a reliable ally of the powerless, just as a general rule. And people who claim to speak for the powerless, sometimes they're very sweet people. Often historically, they're monsters who just want unquestioned power, for themselves. So that's not a great route. Can you democratize discussion and debate and actually have a better influence of less powerful people? I believe you can. And I think one of the best mechanisms ever invented for this very phenomena is the scientific method. It is no mistake that someone as like Michael Faraday, who came from nothing, was able to actually invent, modern sort of electromagnetism along with his, buddy, later protege, James Clerk Maxwell. He came from nothing, and all he had basically was scientific method on his side. And this is one of the reasons why I think Foucault was so fundamentally wrong about the idea that truth is just what power kind of wishes it to be and what power can assert it to be. That was probably true in tribal times. That was true, prior to the scientific revolution. But the scientific method is one of the great equalizers of all time, and done correctly is really has a bias for what the world actually looks like as opposed to what power wishes the world to look like, which is why we undermine scientific method at our deep, deep peril.
I guess when I think about this issue, I think about about as grassroots of a level as there is. In my experience teaching political science, which is obviously very fraught, current American politics. And what I found,
if you get in trouble, we can help, by the way.
Thank you. Well,
we have a great record. We have a great record of it.
But what I found, especially in my last few years in the classroom, is that it was really hard for me to bring in the few conservative students I had in arguments. And this is at Northern Kentucky University. It's a fairly conservative as universities go. And so what I would do is really make a point of trying to bring out those few conservative voices and try to rein in the vast majority of the kids who were rolling their eyes or saying kind of semi-hostile things just because this person would dare to voice an opinion. And so, I felt like I was sort of the state, in a way, stepping in here in my kind of semi-dictatorial powers, deciding who gets to speak when about what. Mm-hmm. But I also feel like in doing that, I was benefiting the entire classroom. And maybe I'm wrong, but if I'm not, I feel like there should be some way to scale that.
Oh, yeah. I don't think you're wrong at all on that. And that's not the exertion of state power. That's a teacher trying to bring people out who aren't speaking. Like the exertion of state power would be, like if you're saying, and if you disagree with these students, you're going to be expelled from school. Like that's an exertion of state power. But trying to encourage people to talk across lines of difference, I am a huge believer in that. I think Monica Guzman wrote a book called I've Never Thought of It That Way that I think is actually, it's a genre of books, but I think that's actually probably the best one that's out there about like really, she's politically liberal. It's talking about, her love of her much more conservative father. It's touching and effective in a lot of ways. So I think structuring ways for people to talk, you would think as a constitutional lawyer, I would be, always arguing for, Oxford style debates. And believe me, like if we had more of those, particularly where people had to take the opinion opposite of what they actually hold, I think that'd be really healthy, because then it becomes much harder to think that people who disagree with you are stupid or evil. But I actually am even a bigger champion at this point in my career of listening projects, where essentially like the idea is like, here's the goal here. You're going to listen to where this person comes from, not with the goal of changing where they come from, but just a goal of understanding where they come from. There was this really cool project. I think it was called Narrative 4. I don't know if it still exists, but where they would take kids from, I actually believe Kentucky, and they'd kind of do a student exchange with a school in the Bronx. And they'd pair up students from the Bronx and Kentucky. And by the end of the day, the students had to describe themselves as if they were the other person. And I'm like, I love that. I love the idea of actually like leaving that day being like, I felt like I got as close to walking in someone else's shoes as I ever could. So there are things that I don't want mandated by the state that I think could be profoundly healthy for us as a democratic, pluralistic society.
What about misinformation and disinformation? Because some people would say that, listen, freedom of speech is all about arriving at the truth, promoting democracy. These things clearly, their goal is to do exactly the opposite. So it's perfectly okay to regulate or even ban, misinformation or disinformation. What do you think?
Well, that's a profound question, and I think it misses something really, really big. Now, and of course, there are like three categories of targeted speech in this case. And the worst one, in my opinion, is malinformation. Malinformation is the idea that sort of like it's true, but it could be misleading. It's like, okay, I don't know how you're going to regulate that if you're saying it's true, but it could be misleading. Oi. But the next one is misinformation, which is just, information that's wrong. Disinformation is intentionally trying to deceive somebody. And that's definitely the most sort of like morally culpable situation. But during the Biden administration, they talk about this like as if all of this stuff was easy to know. And here's one of the great realizations in human history. Yeah, I'm with Yuval Harari that essentially you should actually have called the Enlightenment the discovery of ignorance, because the Enlightenment wasn't suddenly a bunch of people going, I'm so clever. It's going, oh, my God, we know so little once we test it. Once we actually put this to the test, we're like, oh, wow. We were wrong about everything. Wow. And that's, like the fact that truth is hard to know is something that is very hard for people's brains to actually admit, because we have these rationalizing minds that everything looks kind of obvious to us. Everything seems kind of obvious. It's really clear. But actually, when you start testing it, it turns out our perceptions aren't all that reliable. Our memories sure aren't. Our intuitive guesses on like what works are wrong time and time again. So the discovery that truth is hard to know is one of the great discoveries of all time. So the idea that government could just be like, well, we're going to ban misinformation. I'm like, okay, that puts you in the position of arbiter of truth. And that's scary as all get out to me. Now, here's the way a free society is supposed to deal with things like misinformation, disinformation. I don't even know what to do about malinformation. Is essentially what you need are authorities that people trust. And right now, we are in a moment where people don't trust those authorities. And there are people, I think his name is Tom Nash, the guy who writes for The Atlantic, tends to sort of like dismiss this as being kind of like a right-wing conspiracy to dismiss expertise. Meanwhile, I've been working on campus for 24 years. I'm like, dude, like the expert class has done a lot to make people not trust them very much. So it's one of these things where that Yoshua Bengio idea of having AI that's maximized for truth-seeking, I think like we need stuff like that. We need scholars who have shown great deals of integrity. We need systems like to check and recheck, probably at an even more in-depth level than we had before. Because the only solution, really, literally the only solution to misinformation is really, really reliable information. And right now, people, they don't particularly trust academia to produce some of this, particularly if it has any political valence whatsoever. And unfortunately, I've seen people get on campuses get in trouble for being on the wrong side of hot button issues. And what I think people don't quite get is that if people see someone actually get targeted and be suspended for publishing something that is considered sort of inconvenient, particularly if it later out proves to be true, they're never going to trust you again. So I think we're at a kind of dangerous moment for this. And I think that the idea that we could easily police misinformation at this point without it just being politics deciding what opinions it does and doesn't like is naive. And I mean, I'm also darkened by the fact that I'm finally reading Jake Tapper's Original Sin, the one about the Biden administration. And boy, oh my God, it was so much worse than I thought. And that's the kind of stuff that makes people not trust authority, is when basically everyone's being gaslit by saying, oh, this guy's fine. And then you read the book like, oh my God, this guy is so not fine.
So I want to close with sort of a big picture question, or a series of linked questions, I guess, is that when you kind of pull back and look at American society and politics, what, in terms of free speech, is your biggest concern? And if we can close on an optimistic note, which I always try to do, is there anything you see that maybe makes you feel a little bit optimistic?
Sure. I mean, at the moment, we're in a partisan crisis. I think, and certainly the biggest threats are coming from the Trump administration, at the moment. They're doing things towards law firms that I think are just mind-blowing. Basically like targeting law firms for just opposing the administration in court, which is just, I'm not familiar with that ever being the case, at least not on some large scale. Of course, like the attacks on higher ed, I certainly agree that higher ed does need massive reform. I'm a big believer in that. However, it doesn't mean the government can make up like new powers it doesn't have in order to achieve that. Like it definitely draw the line at that. Some of the targeting the media is deeply concerning. But also, I feel like what I'm seeing on the left to a degree, at least in certain circles of it, is we've got nothing to reform. We did nothing wrong. It's just, we're just being attacked by this vicious conspiracy, which is also not true. So all of that makes me like we're in a crisis, and I don't know exactly where we're going to be in the end of this. And I mean that genuinely. However, when it comes to freedom of speech, here's why I am optimistic about it, not necessarily short term, but long term. Societies, institutions, even individuals who can talk about difficult issues honestly and frankly, that have what's called psychologically safe environment where you have like the freedom even to be wrong, to think of ideas, they're always going to have advantages over ones that can't do that. That means, and I think that the free speech, in addition to being, and I always say this, I think of it as a human right. I think it's something that just attaches by virtue of your dignity of being a human. But it's also really useful. It's also something that does convey a big advantage. Certainly companies, and I see free speech wherever I look. We were reading all these management books at FIRE when we did the expansion. And we go into this thing like really humbly being like, oh man, what are we going to learn about everything we're doing wrong in the following 20 freaking management books we read? And we kept on hearing about this thing called level 5 leadership. I'm like, oh geez, what's this going to be? You know what level 5 leadership is? Management that can talk to each other and disagree constructively without it derailing everything. And I'm like, that's dissent. That's freedom of speech. Like that's exactly what I've been on about. And this pops up in the operating room, where having younger doctors and nurses to be able to say, doctor, I think you're wrong, saves lives. Having, reforms at Korean Air, for example, being able to tell the pilot, I think you're wrong, also save tremendous amount of lives. So I see the role of dissent, the argument for it getting stronger and stronger, even while on campuses I feel like we're being told that essentially the argument's getting weaker. So I see a positive future for freedom of speech if people can remember just how incredibly useful it is. And even for things as basic as authenticity, people want to be themselves, for goodness sakes, for good or for bad, for ugly, for pretty. And I think that is something that people really crave and long for. So there are a lot of reasons why I'm optimistic about the long-term period for free speech, but it's going to be a fight together.
And I'll just say I've been a fan of FIRE for a while now, quite a while, and a big fan of everything that you have put out. And so I would encourage folks to check out the book. It's called The War on Words. We'll make sure we have a link in the show notes. And Greg, as always, it was great having you on the show.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the great questions.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,